Mountain flying is a fantastic experience, but to do it safely and enjoyably, you need the right knowledge, training and experience behind you. Between 1995 and 2009, the lack of mountain flying training has been a cause in several fatal aircraft accidents, with at least 29 lives lost. That's why the CAA is adding mountain flying to the PPL and CPL aeroplane syllabuses and has reviewed the helicopter syllabuses. This DVD is an educational tool for those holding or training for a PPL or CPL to visualise some essential mountain flying concepts before training with an appropriately qualified instructor. It covers terrain and weather awareness for PPL level and basic mountain flying skills for CPL level. It does not go into the advanced skills required of Part 135 operators who fly in mountainous environments all the time. With just under 60% of New Zealand's terrain considered mountainous, it's essential that all pilots learn, practice and develop their mountain flying skills. You don't have to be flying amongst snow-capped peaks to develop the skills you'll learn during your mountain flying training. The same principles can be applied to any terrain, no matter how high it is. All pilots understand that no paper manual can ever capture the full sensation of flight. And with that in mind, we've utilised multiple digital video cameras to give you the best possible look at some of New Zealand's most spectacular alpine flying in both helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft. We've also recruited two of the country's most experienced mountain flying instructors and are going to watch on as they share some of their knowledge with two young rookies. Over the course of this DVD, we will give you a detailed introduction to the thrills and potential pitfalls of mountain flying.
Wind is probably the most significant factor influencing your flight within any terrain.
Deciding how to fly there, where to fly, what altitude to fly, is all really depending on your judgment of the wind direction.
There is usually wind in any mountainous area. Assessing its strength and direction will help in planning your route for the smoothest ride. The shape of the terrain will dictate the wind's behaviour. It is useful to imagine the airflow as water. Think about how it would flow over the terrain, where it would accelerate through passes, divert along valley floors, or be forced over a ridge. Consider the angle at which the flow will strike obstacles.
Visualising the flow of the air through terrain as if it were water significantly improves your understanding of how to anticipate what the wind is doing.
If the terrain is very broken, you're obviously going to have quite rough wind. If you've got nice big round hilltops and you're working on the windward side, the wind will be nice and smooth.
Turbulence occurs where flows either mix together, tumble over obstructions, or where the flows decelerate. Water flows around obstacles where possible, and only spills over the top when excessive volume prevents all of it from going around. Below 15 knots, the wind flow is generally predictable.
Notice how rugged the terrain is on the right that we're just passing over. In terms of airflow, what do you expect it to do?
It should be smooth and upflowing on the southern side of that, and then more turbulent on the lee as it tumbles over those obstructions.
Above 15 knots, the patterns alter and become more difficult to predict. While flight at higher altitudes is generally safer, it may not necessarily be more comfortable. The wind is likely to be stronger with altitude, and any up and down drafts or turbulence more severe. Rotors are areas of severe turbulence. They are large closed eddies that form in the lee of mountain ranges, usually under the crests of mountain waves. The wind within rotors could come from any direction, similar to eddies behind a boulder in a river. Updrafts and downdrafts in a rotor can reach over 3,000 feet per minute.
The more you are riding through the turbulence, the more that you're stressing any component of the aircraft, the more that you're compromising the safety.
I thought I would go and have a look at a flight and be able to turn back in time. As it turned out, the conditions were so appalling, there was no question of turning back. And I entered rotor and I found myself virtually flipped on my back. I'd popped rivets in that aeroplane.
Rotors can sometimes be marked by small, ragged, wispy bits of cloud. Be aware of these indicators of turbulence. But often rotors will also be invisible with no cloud indicator.
Why are we experiencing a bit more jiggle in comparison to what we had lower in the valley?
Wind's a bit faster up here.
It's a bit stronger at altitude, and we're sitting at the shear level. So all the air is bubbling over all the tops, and we're sitting in that eddy factor.
Anabatic winds blow up a valley when surfaces are heated during daytime, and katabatic winds blow down a valley when surfaces are cooled during nighttime. These can be influenced by localised effects such as sea or lake breezes.
When is an anabatic wind typically more significant?
If it's coming off a lake or a
If there's
river,
a lake breeze or a sea breeze driving it, then yes.
Yep.
And so you have to be very careful of considering sometimes when you're in the middle of a valley system whether the lake or sea breeze that might be driving it at the mouth is giving you an up valley wind at a particular time of the year, and further in the head of the valley you're getting a down valley wind.
Upper level winds won't always reflect the wind you will experience in a valley below. Other clues are wind lanes on water, tussock, crops or bush, or the drift you perceive when flying across a valley.
What you can see if you look out to Rat Point over on the far side over there, the water is disturbed all the way around the lake. And notice how in the lee of Mount Crichton and Rat Point there, it's not so disturbed, but there's definitely a squall line that comes out at an angle almost to where we are at the moment.
Yep.
So if we were flying around there, we'd be wanting to stay outside that squall line.
So the stronger the wind, the more you need that training, that understanding, that experience to be able to position the aircraft appropriately, configure it appropriately, and manage both the safety of the aircraft and the comfort for those who are on board, not to mention yourself.
Well, I think situational awareness is everything in all aspects of flying, but particularly in mountain flying.
Difficult lighting conditions, contrast, and the sheer scale of the mountainous environment can make it very easy to drastically misinterpret a situation, particularly if your eyes think they see something that is actually a visual illusion, distorting your perception of where you are and how safe you are. In winter, snow cover makes it harder to identify features and judge depth perception. Glaciers, ridges and passes have less definition and are more uniform in appearance.
The definition of where ridges are part of a foreground ridge or a background ridge is not that clear, is it?
No, it's not. With it all being white, they all just merge in together.
Exactly.
So often the foreground can merge into the background, and so identifying what you're actually seeing and verifying it. Don't make assumptions.
If it's covered by snow, you're not going to appreciate the actual contour of the terrain the same.
The position of the sun can cause areas of deep shadow, especially in valleys, that can be impossible to see into. When flying from sunlight into shadow, it can be harder to maintain terrain clearance.
If you come around a ridge or a spur and suddenly you're blinded by the sun in your face, judgment of where the terrain is, where other traffic might be, is non-existent.
And here's the sun coming in your eyes. Notice how difficult it is with this bright out situation of determining how far away that terrain is, how shadowed it is because of the dark bush and the dark water. So planning your turn here in order to not compromise yourself with regard to that terrain.
When the direct light shining on a large unbroken expanse of snow is reduced by an overcast sky, all trace of surface texture or shadows can be hidden. Hollows and snow-covered objects merge into a flattened white background, and any gradient can be disguised.
The terrain itself can merge into the sky. It almost looks like there's a void ahead, so it's a case of being aware of how the different light conditions affect what you're going to see and factor that into your situational awareness.
If at any stage you become unconfident of your visibility proceeding into terrain, it is wisest to adopt a poor visibility configuration while you assess your situation.
Things have been starting to feel a bit busier potentially, haven't they? What do you think you can do?
Going into the bad weather configuration will give me more time to...
The poor visibility configuration, yes.
The worst areas for visual illusions are those of total snow cover, such as the upper neve areas of glaciers. Flight in these areas is only safe when the pilot is familiar with the area and has enough reliable visual cues to determine the position of valley sides and the surface below. Knowing the terrain heights is also essential.
All that area looks rather flat there, doesn't it?
It does.
Can you perceive any gradient?
You can see more slope from one side to the other rather than gradient down.
I want you to make a 90-degree turn and look back up the glacier so that we can see gradient from below.
Oh, it's so evident from this angle.
And see how intimidating it would be if we were lower than what we are now. We perceive we can climb up there, but the glacier is climbing at a vastly greater rate than the ability of the aircraft.
The clarity of the air can also influence this judgment. You can misjudge the space available and the aircraft's inertia when calculating turn radius and the effects of speed, weight, configuration, wind, turbulence and visibility.
You can see how the terrain with the clear air is quite intimidating in terms of its proximity.
Absolutely.
But if you have a look on the map, it's probably a good mile wide. Don't let the terrain bully you.
The first time I flew into a valley that was somewhere near a kilometre wide, I didn't believe that I was going to have room to turn.
So the key is to verify what you think you see, because it may not be quite that way.
If you spot a hut on a mountainside, something that you can recognise the scale and the size of starts to give you the reality of how awesomely large some of this terrain is.
The mountains are probably the ultimate place that a helicopter pilot would like to fly. He's learnt to fly in the basic flat plains, and then he looks at those wonderful mountains and wants to use the helicopter to go there. The helicopter's the perfect tool for doing that. But there's lots of traps in flying in the big high mountains.
Density altitude greatly affects your performance whether you're at sea level or in the mountains.
One aspect of mountain flying that requires particular attention is aircraft performance. As air density decreases, aircraft performance decreases, directly affecting lift and drag, engine power and propeller or rotor efficiency. The density altitude for a particular landing site can vary depending on the ambient conditions. Just because a landing was successfully made on one particular day doesn't mean it will be achievable on another.
Standard atmosphere should be 15 degrees at sea level and 1013 millibars. That means that at 5,000 feet there should be 5 degrees. Most helicopters will perform reasonably well below that altitude, but above that altitude is where the average pilot can start to get into trouble.
It is a good idea to practice working out density altitudes until it becomes second nature.
The altimeter here is reading some erroneous reading. It's not the airfield altitude today.
Yep.
Because yesterday the pressure was what?
101.8.
Right. So let's move this around now to our airfield altitude, 1,140 feet, and we've got a reading there of 1,035.
Yep.
And that's a pretty good pressure.
Yeah, it's really high.
Okay, so how do we work out now what our pressure altitude is today?
Well, if we take that back round to the standard day of 1013.
Okay, so let's just move that around to 1013. Okay. So you've got a pressure attitude today of 600 feet.
Yep.
That's 500 feet below what the helicopter physically is sitting at. Okay? So now we want to know what the density attitude is. So what should be the temperature at 600 feet on a standard day?
Well, at sea level it would be 15 degrees.
That's right.
So it should be 14 degrees, about 500 feet.
That's right. 2 degrees per 1,000 feet it goes down, so it'll be 14 degrees. And what is the actual temperature here today?
So 9. So
That's 9.
got,
So it's even better again, isn't it? By how much?
By 5 degrees,
By
which
5
is
degrees.
500 and 2 5s, 600 feet.
Yeah, each degree is worth 120 feet of altitude, so 5 times 120 is 600. So what does that bring our density altitude
Basically
down to today?
down to sea level.
Exactly. So instead of the helicopter thinking it's at 1,140 feet today, it actually thinks it's at sea level. So it's going to be a good day for flying, isn't it?
Yep, great.
Yeah.
Before venturing into the mountains, it's essential to have a good understanding of the effects density altitude has on performance. Remember, when calculating density altitude, the worst conditions are high, hot and humid. Combine these factors with a low pressure day and aircraft performance will be significantly degraded. For a given indicated airspeed, the true airspeed, or TAS, will be higher. To achieve the total rotor thrust required for flight, collective pitch settings will increase with increasing density altitude. The tail rotor also requires an increase in pitch to counter torque and will be less efficient with an increase in density altitude. In general, higher precision will be required with control inputs with increasing density altitude. VNE decreases with altitude, and the helicopter will be more susceptible to retreating blade stall due to the increase in blade pitch on the main rotor. As the rotor is less efficient at higher density altitude, the power required will increase. Also, you will experience reduced engine power, particularly in normally aspirated piston engines. These factors combine to cause serious performance degradation. Before flight, refer to the performance graphs and to the manifold pressure limitation tables in the flight manual to accurately determine your power requirements.
The recce before you're coming in to land in the mountains is obviously very important.
Think about issues such as size, shape, surround, slope, surface, sun, wind, wires, rubbish, route and revs.
If you consider all those things and everything's okay, then it should be, okay to land there. What do you think of the size?
There's plenty of room.
Yep. The shape?
It's a bit slopey in places, you can tell by the river.
Surrounds? Well, it's surrounded by bush and trees.
Got a lot of trees.
Surface?
So it's going to be gravelly and quite uneven in places by the looks of things.
Slope? Probably not a lot of slope there.
No.
The sun?
Not too much of a problem, it's reasonably high.
Okay. What are the other things you need to consider?
The wires.
Wires? Unlikely to be wires up in this area, but we'll keep an eye out.
So rubbish or loose items, but I can't see from up here.
Wind is the next consideration because that's going to determine which route you go in and out, isn't it? Very little wind indicating on any of the trees here at the moment.
Yeah.
So, which way do you want to approach it?
Well, I'll probably approach down the valley.
I think so, because then it leads you to a better escape route, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Carry out a thorough reconnaissance of any potential landing site. This involves a low approach and overshoot. There is no value in conducting this at high speed. Use this reconnaissance to assess the correct closure rate, as failure to reduce speed early enough will require an overshoot. Your approach angle may vary depending on the wind. The stronger the wind, the steeper the approach will have to be to avoid turbulent air on the lee side of an obstacle.
We'll do a little power check once we've had a low reconnaissance onto the site.
Conduct a power check at an appropriate height above the touchdown point.
The power check is really important. That would be the last part of your assessment in terms of whether it's a safe place to land.
On all takeoffs, the power required to hover should be noted, because as long as weight and conditions remain the same, a similar indicated power setting will be required no matter what altitude the next landing site is at. A common misunderstanding is that more power will be required to hover at a higher altitude.
If it takes 22 inches to hover at sea level, it'll take 22 inches to hover where he's landing at altitude, be it 5,000, 7,000 feet, whatever.
The power available over and above hover power will decrease until you get to an altitude where the helicopter cannot produce enough power to hover. An in-ground effect hover will require less power to hover than an out-of-ground effect hover. To determine if sufficient power is available to land, a pilot can perform an out-of-ground effect hover clear of the landing site, with sufficient height to recover if there is insufficient power to do this. It then stands to reason that if this is able to be accomplished, then there will be ample power for an in-ground effect hover.
Before you come into land, you're doing a power check so that you don't commit yourself to that landing spot and not have enough power to make a safe landing.
Okay, Pete, let's just quietly come up to the hover and see how much power it's taking us to hover.
Sure.
And it should read around about the same, provided the conditions are the same, as what we did when we first took off at the airport. We have burnt off a little bit of gas now, so we're slightly lighter, and you notice now it's taken us 21.5 inches to hover.
Yep.
Okay? And the maximum we can pull up here was what?
24.5.
So that gives us
Power margin of 3.5.
So that's quite a bit of power.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got no problems with taking off from the site.
All landings require a degree of reconnaissance. The amount will depend on your experience and the conditions. The higher the landing site is, the more critical the approach is. It is advisable to fly a slow approach using power rather than a fast flare type of approach.
And you find it's quite hard to assess the closure rate, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because we're coming through this big void area. We've got no ground sort of moving underneath us.
A fast flare type of approach will not allow you to accurately assess the necessary landing cues because you'll be too busy slowing the helicopter up during the approach.
Going a bit fast.
It's fast, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now you're going to have to do a big flare to get onto the spot, so let's try that. And it feels not very nice at all. Let's overshoot off this. If a pilot is coming in too fast, he's far better off overshooting, going around again and setting it up again and learning to slow up before he thinks he needs to slow up.
A slower approach just on translational speed with power on will enable you to double check the landing cues, such as the power needed to land, the wind, airspeed versus ground speed, power being used, and rate of descent.
Purposely slow down before we think we need to slow down. Now have a look at your airspeed. You've got 35 knots, but it certainly doesn't look like you're doing that fast across the ground, does it?
Got a little bit of wind there.
And you can see a few little wind indicators now on the tussocks. Pick your spot. Very good. How did that feel compared to your first approach?
It felt much better the second time. I felt more in control and you've got more time to pick your landing spot.
When selecting a landing site, different types of terrain will present various challenges and require different considerations. Here are some things to think about for each different type of terrain.
A plateau is usually an open area, and so generally it's a pretty good place to land.
Approaches and departures are normally unrestricted and similar to any other landing at lower altitudes.
You're coming into hover over snow, so what are you going to expect? Maybe some blowing snow?
Blowing snow, and we're going to sink into the snow a little bit.
And just easing down now gently, expecting a slope, and if there's not one, we'll be pleasantly surprised. Just gently forward down, picking your landing site now.
Okay, got a nice smooth spot there, just gently down. Tail rotor's clear. It's very now nice.
That's very nice.
Okay, and just pumping a little bit just to break through the crust if there is any. I think that's pretty solid there actually.
That's good. Well done.
Open tussock country above the tree line presents good landing opportunities. However, the actual landing position requires careful selection because the clumpy nature of the vegetation masks the actual surface of the ground, sometimes making it difficult to achieve a firm, stable landing.
And there's often occasions where you can land and you have to feel the helicopter down very gently and feel whether it feels stable. If it doesn't, well then obviously you have to move or shift or lift and take off and find another spot. So we're going to come and land down here. You've selected your spot. You notice it's quite hard to see the ground because of the vegetation.
Yeah.
So let's just start easing forward and in there and do the best you can.
Sloping quite a lot.
Okay, so let's just come down, be accurate, put your skids exactly where you want them to go, where you indicate, where you think the best spot is, out there, gently touching down, and tell me if you like it or not. No, didn't like that at all, did you? That wasn't very nice at all. So just need to be gentle. Just come down there now, and just ease it down, just feeling it. Okay, just feeling it, looking out front, expect a slope, there, just there. Do you like it?
No.
No. Okay, not a good spot to land.
No.
So let's not do it. Okay. The other danger that can occur in the high tussocks summertime is that sometimes the exhaust on helicopters can set fire to them. And that's just an added complication, but basically the biggest problem is finding level ground within the tussocks themselves.
Rounded knolls or hilltops are normally even, non-sloping ground. Wind direction and strength are easy to detect and will have laminar flow. Provided the knoll is nicely rounded, there is little chance of turbulence even in strong wind.
Any wind that will be flowing over that rounded knob will be reasonably smooth because it's not like it's a sharp jagged peak going to create a lot of turbulence.
Approach speeds can be difficult to assess.
When you're landing on flat ground, you've got ground coming past you, whereas on a rounded knoll you've got nothing coming past you, so it's a little bit harder to judge your approach speed.
If the ground is not level, landing slightly beyond the brow will place the heels of the skids on higher ground than the toes, effectively putting the helicopter in a safe nose-low position, reducing the likelihood of the helicopter tipping backwards and the tail rotor striking the ground. When approaching a saddle, you should endeavour to work out the prevailing wind direction to establish the best landing approach. Level ground can usually be found somewhere in a saddle. Wind tends to increase due to the Venturi effect between higher ground either side.
Because of the Venturi effect, or the forcing of air through a narrow pass, that wind can increase in velocity hugely. It's when there's light winds, generally less than 10 knots, makes it a little bit hard to work out which is the right way. And one technique that we use is to fly one way and set it up as an approach, assess the ground speed versus the airspeed, and then go around and fly it the other way and assess the ground speed versus the airspeed, and work out and determine through the sort of the seat of the pants feel whether one felt better than the other. You utilise the GPS if you want to see if there's any difference in ground speed versus airspeed, but really that's only an aid. You want to do it by sort of visual references. So let's just gently fly on by, and now looking for little clues on the tussock, on the grass, to see if we can see any indication of wind.
There's hardly any movement on the tussocks down there at all, actually.
Okay, we'll go and try exactly the same approach from the opposite direction. Did you sense there that translation came slightly earlier while we were still moving forward? So I think you had a slight wind up your tail there.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Okay, so why don't we re-circuit now and we'll do an approach from our original first direction. Very nice. That's good.
In a saddle, rising ground either side may compromise rotor blade clearance, so caution should be exercised if disembarking.
If you watch a seagull soaring the ridges, you'll find that they don't sort of set up a big long final approach onto a ridge. They will soar along the side of the ridge in the updrafting wind and then just do a little 90-degree turn and come plop and land on the ridge.
If the wind is blowing at right angles to a ridge, considerable turbulence will be experienced on the downwind side, making a conventional approach into wind difficult.
And as we coming in here, you may start to feel a little bit of turbulence coming off the ridge because it's at right angles to the airflow coming towards us. And the sharper that ridge, the more turbulence that you would be likely to experience.
As an alternative, the updrafting air on the upwind side can be utilised by flying along the ridge, offsetting drift with yaw, turning into wind when the landing site is approached and the helicopter passes through translation. This method can save large amounts of power and also has the advantage of having more overshoot options.
You think that's probably too far, but as you touch now, see that feels quite level.
Yeah.
And you feel like you're sitting out over the edge of the ridge. But remember, most of the weight of the helicopter is on the heels of the skid, so the heels need to be on the good part of the ridge. Even if the toes are just slightly downhill, it'll feel much better than falling backwards.
Following the ridge line, it means you know exactly where you're coming in to land. It's much easier to find the landing spot, and the wing gives you a great deal of help to maintain your lift. You're hardly using as much power, and it's a nice, gentle, steady approach.
In bush country, creeks and rivers may provide the only clear area in which to land. The best landing site is level ground on sandy or gravel beaches. Landing on damp or wet ground is preferable to dry ground to avoid blowing dust around. Blowing dust will cause damage to the helicopter, particularly the rotor blades. Positively identify a touchdown point if you are landing. The helicopter footprint will become more familiar as your experience on type increases.
You'll have to be quite accurate where you place the skids. Where do you want the tail?
I want my tail as far into that as possible.
So the tail over that clear area there?
Yeah.
So move the helicopter forward and put your skids
tail rotor
exactly
clear
where you want to with a nice little zero-speed landing. Very nice. Well done.
The accurate placement of the skids on a particular spot requires practice.
Hooking up a skid is the last thing that you want to have happen, because the general tendency is once a skid is hooked up, the pilot will tend to get a fright and want to pull the helicopter straight off the ground, resulting in dynamic rollover, which is where the helicopter just rolls straight over before he can even blink his eye.
Backing up can be dangerous because of the lack of visibility. If it has to be done, a slightly higher hover than normal is recommended to give good tail rotor clearance.
Just like reversing in your car, you need to know it's clear before you reverse backwards. So we need to turn quietly. How are you going to do it? You need to turn the tail to your clear side. Is it clear out your side there?
It is clear.
So just turn the tail out round there until you can see the area that you want to back up to.
Clear there.
Right, and we have a look now. That's quite good behind us there, isn't it? Okay?
Yep.
Reversing was a manoeuvre that I absolutely hated. I certainly wouldn't want to do it without Simon sat next to me.
Here are some tips to help reduce your likelihood of getting lost in the mountains, or to help confirm your position should you ever become disoriented on a flight. Be aware of the alignment of valleys relative to the compass.
GPS is an important tool for verifying one's positions. It shouldn't be the only tool.
Which way is back to the airfield?
We were heading on a roughly southerly heading as we came into this valley system, and now we're heading roughly north on the way back out.
Which way is the river flowing?
I can see it quite clearly below us. It's flowing the same direction that we're flying in, so we should be heading in the right direction.
Downstream means to larger rivers, lakes, the sea, towns, other features that allow us to orient ourselves.
Significant white water in a stream indicates a steep gradient. Note the position of the sun when entering a valley. Compare this to the sun position when you leave the valley. If you haven't spent much time in the valley, it should give you an accurate reference point.
Okay, any other clues as to your direction?
Well, the sun was behind us as we came in, and now it's directly in front of us, so that was another clue.
That would make sense.
Knowing where we are on our chart starts right back at the planning stages. Far too big a map now for in the cockpit, isn't it?
It is.
So let's make it a functional size. We don't want to be head down in the cockpit, we need to be head up. Folding the chart into a manageable size so that we can hold it in our left hand whilst holding the control column. Glance at the chart. You can see now you have the operating area there. So you'll be able to sit here with your finger on the map and follow your path as you go around it. Therefore, still maintaining peripheral vision for our lookout, our proximity to terrain, and our maintenance of the control of the aircraft's attitude.
There are a number of difficulties associated with flying in the mountains. Each of these can affect your performance as a pilot. There is a high workload while mountain flying. Therefore, good management of the aircraft and your passengers is important to reduce stress levels and enhance sound decision making. Flying in turbulence will add to your fatigue and may nauseate you.
It's important to anticipate where you expect it to be, and therefore to be able to give your passengers some anticipation of the ride that they're going to experience.
And say, look, we are going to get a few bumps here. It's quite okay. Put your seatbelts on. This is quite normal for these conditions. Keep a calm demeanour and look as though you know what you're doing.
That gives them some confidence in your competence.
Know when to turn back so you don't have to fly while fighting off air sickness. Remember that flight between 10,000 and 13,000 feet is allowed for a maximum of 30 minutes without oxygen. Below 10,000 feet, if you are healthy, you should not be significantly affected by hypoxia. However, if you are unwell or a smoker, you will be more susceptible. Even between 5,000 and 8,000 feet, your brain will generally not work as efficiently as it does at sea level.
One of the symptoms of hypoxia is a feeling of euphoria.
And the other one is the nails on their hands turning blue.
Look for the symptoms of hypoxia in your passengers, as you are unlikely to recognise them in yourself.
If they're exhibiting any symptoms of hypoxia, then be alerted to the fact that quite likely then you will be also.
The higher you fly, the drier the air, so be alert to dehydration. Glare is also greater with altitude. Reflections occur from cloud and snow-covered terrain. Wear sunglasses to combat this. When using cabin heat, regularly check the carbon monoxide detector to ensure there are no gases leaking into the cockpit. A clean windscreen is very important. Be aware that rain on the windscreen can affect your visual judgment.
If you suddenly have to auto-rotate, do you try and stretch it to go to a valley floor? Or do you accept where you are there and now and put it down as best you can on the unsuitable terrain right around you?
When flying in the mountains, your options for an auto-rotational landing are very limited. There's a high possibility that no open or flat ground will be available. The wind direction, strength and turbulence will also affect your options. Always remember the golden rule. A good auto-rotation to a bad spot is preferable to a bad auto-rotation to a good spot.
Everything was to go quiet and we needed to auto-rotate, what would you do?
I'd probably go down, try to get down to the valley.
Right, but as we get closer to the hill here, what would you do now? You just have to go, well, I'll just do one straight here and do the best I can.
Yeah.
So that is the situation that will be a horrible decision to make. We've got engine failure now, so let's enter auto-rotation. Adjust the RPM, and you notice the RPM goes a little bit higher at higher altitude.
Yep.
So you've got to Just adjust that slightly, get the speed organised, and now, where are you going to go? What do you think? Down along there?
Yeah.
Good, that's looking good. At about treetop height, about there, start to flare, keep flaring as long as we can to our desired landing speed, which is quite slow on this gravel, forward and cushioning the landing onto the ground. Very good, well done. How did that feel?
Very smooth. It's great.
Must be the pilot.
It must be, or the instructor.
It would be very difficult to achieve a successful auto-rotational landing downhill, as you would not be able to flare hard enough due to the downsloping terrain. If possible, flare uphill and cushion onto the side of the hill. Facing uphill will also reduce the likelihood of the helicopter rolling over backwards.
One of the dangers of mountain flying is that it's all very nice in the cockpit of the helicopter with a heater on. But when you get out there in the biting cold wind in that very hostile environment, it can kill you.
Before venturing into the mountains, dress appropriately and make sure that your aircraft survival kit is fully stocked. Be aware of the contents and how they can best be used. Remember the principles of survival: location, water, food and shelter, and at all times maintain your will to survive.
You can see there's a bit of snow and precipitation there.
You need to be making the assertive decisions to turn back. Pushing on is going to force you into a reactive situation. That's when you are least likely to do the right things, make the right decisions.
I'd far sooner sit on the bloody hillside, stay there in a complete machine, although it was cold, than risk getting up there and bending it.
Just remember, it's not the mountains that are dangerous, it's only the pilots that are dangerous.
Poor decision making or inappropriate decisions, lack of decisions, the mountains are unforgiving of.
One of the most difficult things about mountain flying is you don't know what you don't know until you've experienced it for the first time. Unless your first experience is under controlled conditions with an appropriately qualified instructor to guide you, you could get yourself into a situation that you don't have the skills to get out of. The minimum instructor requirements for teaching terrain awareness and basic mountain flying can be found in the Mountain Flying Training Standards Guide, produced by the CAA. The minimum requirements for helicopter instructors can be found in AC 6118.
It's a matter of getting the appropriate training and therefore being able to make the appropriate decisions in order to survive and enjoy the environment.
It does get easier as you practice things. Having an instructor there to remind you, you need that to start with, but then once your brain sort of picks it up, you start to remind yourself about things.
Just because you learn to fly in some small mountains in one place doesn't mean to say that you can tackle the large ones somewhere else. And there is absolutely no substitute for experience.
If anyone's there thinking, should I go for advanced mountain training? I would say go for it. You'll challenge yourself, you'll learn new skills that you can apply to your other flying environments, and it will just make you a much better pilot.
You're always learning. It's a classic environment where if you think you've finished learning, it's time to put your boots up and stop flying.
Mountain flying can be summed up with 4 simple principles: horizon, position, options, and anticipation. If we can superimpose an imaginary horizon on any variable terrain, then we can reference the aircraft to where we need it to be. Always putting ourselves in the appropriate position, whether it be in a valley, in a saddle crossing, such that we have options. We always have the escape route available to us. And we do those because we anticipate. Given that, we can enjoy and survive flying in the mountains.
Practicing mountain flying will make the things you learn through good instruction a permanent part of your skill set. Think about the tips you have learned from this DVD and revisit it from time to time. Apply what you have learned so that you and your passengers can safely enjoy the pleasures of mountain flying over a long and happy flying career.